So this is the second experiment to test for the anion compound in an ionic compound. And we're focusing on sulfate here. So all of the chemicals, all the compounds tested here will have sulfate as the anion. And in this bracket relies on it's a double decomposition reaction in which hydrochloric acid is added to the sulfate compound. That is a catalyst for the reaction to occur. And then we add barium chloride. And what happens is that barium bonds with the sulfate to form an ionic bond, and barium sulfate forms a precipitate. It is insoluble. So another precipitate reaction similar to the hydroxide one, except that we're making barium sulfate on each occasion. So we should expect that the precipitate will be exactly the same every time, but we'll just test these 5 compounds and check to make sure that's the case. So we're going to begin by testing sodium sulfate. So I'll put a few drops of sodium sulfate into the spotting tray here. You can just note down, oops, somebody didn't do that up properly. So we've got a few drops of sodium sulfate in there. We'll add a couple of drops of hydrochloric acid, remembering this is the catalyst. A couple of drops. And now we'll add barium chloride, and we're expecting that the barium will bond with the sulfate to form barium sulfate as a precipitate. Great. A couple of drops there, and I'm not sure if you can see that, but there's a real white, milky precipitate being formed there. Okay, the second sulfate compound is potassium sulfate. So go down here, potassium sulfate, a couple of drops. Again, a little bit of hydrochloric acid to get the reaction going. Again, we add barium chloride. Again, a precipitate has been formed. Moving on to copper sulfate. A few drops of copper sulfate. Couple of drops of hydrochloric acid. And we want to be really careful with our observations here, because the copper sulfate has that blue, light blue colour to it in solution. But we're looking for the precipitate to see what colour that is. It is generally a white precipitate there. Of course, there's a bit of the copper sulfate still in solution there, so there's also a blue colour in the solution which is reflecting onto the white precipitate, but the precipitate itself is white. Now we have nickel sulfate. Couple of drops of hydrochloric acid. Then add the barium chloride. Yet again, a white precipitate being formed there. And lastly, we have a bit of zinc sulfate here. Add the hydrochloric acid as a catalyst. And the barium chloride. There we go, a white precipitate has been formed. So, as expected, all of the sulfate compounds, when hydrochloric acid and barium chloride were added, barium sulfate was formed, and barium sulfate was insoluble and a precipitate. Make sure you've got full set of results there. Thanks for watching.